Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining. This is day 11 of Oracle Integrations training session. And in this session, we will learn about integrations where we will pass array values as a request payload, and we'll see that how we can configure our integrations to return a response as an array of from that integrations. We'll see that one. And always while working on this requirement, we have to be used at for each, which is for each loop action available in OIC. That we'll see that how we can iterate loop over repeated element in OIC. Then we'll see that how we can create JavaScript functions in OIC to achieve few scenarios that which is not available in OIC and which can be difficult to achieve through OIC. So that's we are going to cover. Later we'll go for global variables, and for that global variable we have data assist to assign on that. We'll see that one too. And in last we'll see some test cases and scenarios that where we can use all these global variables in that the while working on the projects, and also we'll see that one too. So let us start with the first slide, which is that requirement to create one integration. So here you can see we have to create one integrations. In that integration, we will pass this request payload as request payload as an array element to our integrations. You can see this is array of the student information. We are going to pass to this integration, and we are going to design integration in a such way that integration will return response like that. You can see the serial number one of the student serial number one having the registration number. This is the registration number which we are going to generate using JavaScript. And again, for serial number two, we have this registration number, and both are unique for these two students. So that we are going to learn in our sessions at how we can achieve. And obvious for generating this registration number, we have to go for JavaScript functions. That what that function is going to do, we'll get to know about that one too. So if you will see the code, the logic behind generating this registration number is, you can see the first two character is the first name of student, and you can see AL is the first name of first two character of name of a student, that is Alex. You can see SA for Sam here, and the last two character is for first two character of the class. So the Alex is in BTech, so BT is the first two character for this, and same MTech MT is the first two character for class that's added. And between these two, right, first two character and last two character, between these two we have time stamp. You can say the 2024 10th 26th the today date, and 14th is the hour, 52 is the minute, and 19 is the second. So that kind of logic we added, and obviously we will achieve this using JavaScript function. So we'll see that how it will work, right? So you can see this is the JavaScript function. I took help from ChatGPT to design these functions, and using that we got this function JavaScript function, and we will use these JavaScript functions in our integrations to achieve that kind of solution. So you can see these functions having two parameters. I given the name of this function as FOAS underscore generate code. This function having two parameters, that is the name and class name. So why these two parameters are there? Because we have to generate this code based on that username, the student name, and the student class. That's why these two parameters are there in that functions. And based on that two parameters, we added another option for timestamp. So we created this code is just for generating the timestamp, which we are going to concatenate here in between, right? So in last, you can see the first this variable is just going to give our first name in the first two character of the name, and the second one is just giving us to second one is just giving us to last first two character of that class. And this code from here to here is just for generating the timestamp, and later on in the last we use that variable which we are concatenating all these three, so that we are going to learn. So I'm not obvious going to teach you JavaScript. That's why I'm not focusing on this point. That obvious you can write your own logic based on your requirement in the JavaScript code, so that you can achieve or you can use that code in libraries to obvious access that functions in OIC. So you can see I created this integration. This is quite simple integration. So in this integration, this is the endpoint where we are receiving array element, and then we added for each loop. This is the for each loop. In the for each loop, we iterated this for each loop based on that the array element or number of records we receive as a request payload. And inside that we use one assign. we use this assign to store the code which is coming from JavaScript function, and then this code we use data stitch here to we created one global variable. That global variable we use to generate this kind of schema in response, so that we can concatenate each and every record coming from the request by a loop, and then we are appending all this value, the code and the serial number of the student, serial number of the student, and code coming from that variable in a in a JSON payload. So then and later we use this the global variable here to map, so that integration can return that value in a response. So that we are going to achieve in our integration. So we will cover. So always for creating this kind of information, this kind of integrations, we require few points to be covered. The points is that we need to be aware about the global variables. We need to be aware about that the for each loop, and obviously we need to be aware about the JavaScript functions creation and calling OIC. So all these three first we will discuss, then we'll go for OIC to create integrations to achieve that solution. So you can say the first we will talk about the for each loop. So obvious this for each loop is quite simple, that where we are just adding the for each loop in our integrations. To for each is our action in OIC for your information, and that we are using for each loop to iterate over the repeating element. That repeating element can be coming from a request payload, or it can be coming from response of an API. So that we are going to learn in this session, that how we can achieve. And yes, obviously in OIC, every endpoint or every actions having their own limitations. But in Generation 3, we don't have any specific limitation that how much time this for each loop can iterate. So the earlier it was 5,000, but we don't have in Generation 3. So obviously we have the limitation in while from where we will get that array element, we have that limitation on the endpoint only. For example, if we have lakhs of record, right, a list of array element, so obviously that file size or response size can be increased and it can create problems. So obviously that will be solved in that endpoint side only, that from where it's coming. So we are going to learn that one too. So when obviously when we're talking about for each loop, so when we are using for each loop in app-driven integration, it's quite simple that we just have to use for each action in OIC to, and in for each action it will ask you the repeated element to be mapped. That repeated element, it means that array element to be mapped while adding the while adding that for each action, so that this for each loop can be iterated over the repeated element. But in schedule integration, when we are using this same for each loop, so we are getting one more option. That additional option is that parallel item process. So this parallel item process you will only get when you will use for each loop in schedule integrations, or obviously if you are not going to use that one in that while loop, we are not going to use in that one. So that comes up there, and obviously this parallel. So if you will see, by default when we are adding for each loop in our Oracle integration, so it will work like serially, that serial process. So one by one, it will take each and every record from that endpoint, that array list, and it will iterate loop over there. But if you select the parallel processing, so generally we are using parallel processing to make the process faster, and that's allow in schedule integrations, so that in schedule integration most of the time we are processing bulk record, so that record can be processed parallelly, so that in OIC only it will split records in different batches internally, and then it will start processing of all these record parallelly, so that it can be bit faster in OIC. So, and obvious concept will be same for even you include this one or not, that loop iterations and all these things will be same only. It's just for internal OIC, so that they can make your loop iteration bit faster. So now once we are adding that for each action in OIC, so you can see the screenshot I added. So this is the endpoint, the array endpoint we are getting as a request payload. You can see the SQL information is array here, and this you can see the box, upper box is the icon to identify that array element. So somewhere if you will see this icon, it means that this student info is a node, and this is array element, and inside this node we have name, we have attributes, or the column as serial number, name, and many more other columns are there, right? So this array element we are going to map in this repeating element of for each loop. So once you will configure your for each loop in OIC, it will ask you to map or provide the repeating element node. So once you will provide the repeating element node, it will ask you to provide the current element name. This current element name is just like a looping variable or loop variable. For example, we have four records coming from this endpoint, coming from this array. So loop will iterate four times, and each and every times it will store one record, right? So that record where it will store, that's why we required one variable here. So whatever element name you will provide here, that element name will be treated as a variable, and that variable will store all this column, which column inside the endpoint, the repeating element. So here you can see we dragged here this one and we provided the array element name, and this array element value name, or that the variable, right? The array variable we added here. This array variable will be available in all where in the mapping, always inside the loop only. So inside the loop scope, if you want to use the element of this repeating element, you can achieve or you can use using this loop variable. So if yeah, so here you can see this is the scope of for each loop. You can see that for each we added, and this is the scope of for each loop. And inside the scope, we added this assign, that assign variable to store some values. And here you can see once we added in the mapping, right? In the mapping for source in left hand side, you will be able to see the loop variable which created. We created the loop variable name as loop var underscore student info. This is the same variable we created here, loop var underscore student info. And this variable is going to store the node of the repeated elements. You can see this is the node of repeated element, that the student information. This node having multiple variables like a serial number and the name and many more, right? So that all you will be able to find in this variable, the looping variable. So here you can see this loop variable, loop var and the student information, having the node as a student info, and that student info obviously having that all the columns or the this loop variable having the node, and node having all the columns or the attributes for that repeating element, and that obvious out of all these things you can use in your variable assignment and the variable mapping or anywhere inside this scope only. So this is the loop variable. This loop variable will you will be able to access only inside this for each block, right? You can see this is the for each block. Outside this for each block, this variable will not be accessible. And obviously in some scenarios, if you want to access this node or access this endpoint outside this scope, that's why you will have to create global variable, and in that global variable you will assign this value, so that outside the scope you can use that value in the from the global variable. So that kind of things we can do. So now we done with this basic of the for each concept, and then move to that the next slide, which will explain about the libraries and that JavaScript which we are going to create under the libraries to perform few actions which we cannot generally achieve using OIC. So that obviously using JavaScript we can add various logics, that logics you can and implement in OIC to achieve the situation. So obviously in OIC, JavaScript functions are used to enhance our integrations and give us more flexibilities to add additional logic in OIC. And when we are talking about JavaScript functions, that functions we are going to create under library. And in the library, when you will create any of the library, you will have to pass that the code, the JavaScript code, and that code can contain multiple functions, the JavaScript functions. And all these functions, whatever you will use, that function will be available in your Oracle integrations, that OIC canvas page, so that you can invoke that functions, and by invoking that functions you can achieve your desired solution. So this is the things, right? So here in the library we don't have option to create, so that option is just you have to click on import. While importing, it will ask you to upload the JavaScript file, that's that .js file. So here you can see I added the JavaScript file given name as check even .js. So this JavaScript function having JavaScript file having one functions named as check even odd, and this check in even odd having one input parameters named as p number, and it's having one output parameters as result. So P number data type is number and the result data type is a string. So that all you can define while creating your JavaScript function. So in the next slide, if you will see, so this is the JavaScript that JS file we loaded. And in the JS file, what code is there? You can directly click on this edit icon or the view icon, and you can see the code added there. So for this example, I taken a code. That's code is just taking a number, and based on that number, it's giving you the value as even or just checking that the number is divided by 2 or not. So that kind of simple functions you can create. And in OIC, when we want to use that JavaScript functions, obviously you can use that specific JavaScript functions using JavaScript action or action call added in OIC. Or you have another option that in the mapping, if you want to call these functions in the mapping, so you can just go to the mapping, and once you will click here in the advanced option, you will be able to see that your functions created under the custom functions. So in the functions tab, we have custom function. In the custom function, you will be able to see this functions created. So function name, you are able to see check even odd, and you can see this is the same function we created, check even odd. And you can map this function in mapper or somewhere you want to use. So here you can see I use the JavaScript function while providing the mapping to the integration. So you can see here I use check even odd functions, and these functions require one parameters. That parameters you can take from any source or any hard-coded values you will pass. So this function will take this value and it will return one value and response, and that response will be mapped to this endpoint. So that's we are going to learn in our upcoming slide when we will see all these things. And obviously, when we talk about that, we can use JavaScript by in the mapper just by using these functions. And another, if your integration, if you want to invoke the JavaScript functions, so you can have that the JavaScript action call. Using that, you can call. So you can see if you will move forward here in the screenshot, you are able to see this is our integration page. In the integration stage, we added that invocation of the JavaScript action. In the JavaScript invocations, we added the JavaScript functions. You can see the function we added the check even odd, and in the functions we provided the parameters as a value. That's the name which we have to pass. So that this JavaScript function, the check even odd function, will take this name as an input parameters, and this endpoint will give you response coming from that function. So that's we have in OIC to call JavaScript function. Now we will talk about global variable. So as we have option to create variable using assign. So when we are creating variable using assign, we are creating variables that can store only single values, and the data type of that assigned variable will only always be a string. But obviously, if you want to create variable which can have different types of data, right? They can store repeated element, they can store that nodes and all unstructured data, just like JSON request payload or JSON structure and all, that it cannot be achieved using variable created assign. That's why we have global variable concept. So in the global variable, we have different data type to select so that that variable can will be created based on the data type. So the data type is a string, boolean, date time, number, and most common and most important, specifically where we are using global variable, is object. So when you will select data type of global variable object, it will ask you to provide the sample type or provide you the node. So whatever node you will provide, that variable will store that all the components or all the attributes to that global variable. So for example, here you can see one of our requirement, right? Initial when we were discussing in the first slide, we have to return back response in this format. So what we will do, we will create one global variable. That global variable will store these two values in that. So that's why we have to create a global variable or object. And each and every time when we will iterate the loop, we will map this variable here. So that that variable can store these two value, and this two value can be added as a array. So we will create one global variable for that. So we'll see. So now here you can see we talk about the global variable. Global variable give us flexibility to create variable by selecting the complex data type. That complex data type contain all these data type that can be the date type and object type and all. And obviously when we are talking about global variable can be accessible outside the scope. So when we are talking about global variable can be accessible outside the scope, It means that here, let me show you one example of the integration. Here you can say this is the for each loop we added, and whatever elements or whatever variable you will create inside the for each loop, that will not be accessible outside this for each loop. That's the concept of a scope, right? So this is the scope of scope of for each loop. If you will create a variable inside the for each loop, that variable value you will not be able to access outside this for each loop. So, but in case of global variable, if you will create global variable and you will assign value here, you will be able to achieve that value or access the value outside the scope. So that's we all will learn all this just by creating integrations, and we'll see the one by one. And now we created a global variable. We do get to know about the global variable and its type. Now we will talk about the data stitch. So data stitch is an action provided in OIC to perform operations on global variable. For example, the variable we created using assign can be assign. We can update that variable using the assign action only. But global variable, if you created one global variable and you want to update the value of global variable, assign action cannot be used to update the value of the global variable. So that's why we have data stitch action used to perform operations on global variable, just like you have to add value to the global variable or you have to remove the value from the global variable. And obvious global variable having the capabilities that if we are creating global variable as an object, that's having the capabilities that we can use a repeated element and we can consider or we can make that global variable as array. So obvious when we are saying that we have to create global variable as array, so at the time we have to append the value to that global variable so that that global variable can store repeated element or that it can store the array element or multiple elements in that. So that's we are going to done when we will create integration. So just like operation wise, I told you that global variable, we can perform three operations. We can perform append operations to add the multiple values to the global variable. We can use assign in operations in global variable, or that using data stitch to update the value to that variable so that previous value will be override using the latest value. And we can use remove operations or you remove action of that is data stitch so that we can delete specific values from that global variable. So all this we are going to learn in our upcoming slide. So now you can see once you will create any of the global variable. So for creating the global variable, you just have to click on this X icon. So this is the icon where you will click and you will get option to create global variable. So you have to provide the global variable name, and by providing the global variable name, if you will select the global variable type as object, this one object. So once you will select global variable type as object, it will ask you to provide a element. You will ask you to provide the node for that global variable. So here you can see in the right hand side we have this node, and I drag this response wrapper node to here so that this node can store the global variable, that this global variable can store this kind of structure or this kind of endpoint in that variable. So that's we are going to learn in our session. And obviously, we will talk about few scenarios where we can use or use data stitch and global variable. So one of the common example we discussed in the starting of the integration only, that where we have to return the array element from the integrations. Just that array element we will create using global variable. So that will be the one scenarios where we have to use. Another can be that suppose your requirement is to map the response of FTP read operations and you want to access this FTP endpoint outside this scope. For example, we added a scope. So a scope is something that we are going to use handle the exceptions. So we will cover this scope in next session. So I told you that whatever actions or whatever endpoint you are going to use inside the scope, you will not be able to access this all the endpoint outside the scope. The way sometimes we have to get the value outside the scopes, that global variable will help you that. So for example, we added FTP connection. That FTP connection is help us to reading the file from file server, and that FTP connection response having multiple response data or the information coming from the file. So With the help of FTP endpoint, we read the file, that file having 10 records, and we want to access all these 10 records outside the scope. Is not possible in this case. That's why we have global variable. We will use global variable so that using data stitch, we will assign value to the global variable inside the scope, and outside the scope, we can access that value. So that's we all are going to learn in our upcoming session. So now we are done with all this, just the information on the actions. Let's go to the OIC instance where we will learn how we can create that integration. So, so you can see this is the simple integrations which I explained in the starting. This integrations, let me first show you the example of this integration, right? So then we will explain you the integration. So this is the integrations I created, and this is app-driven integrations. If I will run this integration, this integration having body as a request payload, and in the request payload we are passing values. So here you can see, let me show you the request payload data. So you can see this is the request payload which I given in the example also, and this is the same request payload here we have in the integration body as a request payload. Sometimes when you will provide the value here, so column sequence can be up and down. It's not an issue. So it automatically OIC is changing this one randomly. There is no fixed rules and syntax for that. So here you can see the first value is free, class is a serial number, and but what we provided serial number, name, and class. So as this is JSON format, and JSON format having the flexibilities to provide value in any sequence, you can provide values that class you can provide in upper, in below, and all. So it will not impact you in your integration. So let me copy this one again, and here I am removing this request payload and I'm passing the request payload here. So you can say this is the student information, this is the student array information, that we have two student information. Let me add one more student information here. So the serial number I'm going to give 3, and name will be like Max, and they done BCA, pass year is 21, and is pending. So this is the student information we are going to pass to the integration. So what this integration will do, this integration will use this information for each and every record. It will iterate this record over the loop using the loop, and for each and every loop it will take these two value, name and class. It will pass these two value to the function will return the code, and based on the serial number it will return as the registration or code, whatever is there. So this is our integration. We don't have a response right now. So just I'm going to submit this integration by click on run button. You can see the integration got completed, and once the integration will be completed, you will get a response. And here we got error. Let me check why I got error. Somewhere I done mistake. Okay. So what error it's showing, that you can see it's showing error in the starting of integration only. That a start rest you have an endpoint, and it's showing error that's invalid structure. Whatever structure we provided, that is not correct, right? That is invalid. So why that's invalid? You can see here, this is first column, and after the first column we have another column, right? And the comma is the one who is going to separate the column, right? So after this first values we have to give comma, so that this value and this value can be separated. So we missed comma here, so I will provide the comma here. So now this is our correct JSON format, so I will copy, let me paste it again in the body, right? So here I provided comma, all this one, that is correct. Just I will click on run. So here you can see when we got error, right, our integration got terminated. So that's why a scope comes in the picture in OIC. With the help of a scope we can handle this error or exceptions. So we'll learn all in our upcoming sessions. So this is the correct value. I'm just going to click on run. So once I will click on run, it will iterate the loop over this record, and it will provide the value in response. So you can see in the response we got the value. What value we got? So if I will copy this one, and here in response you can see we got the value node as s2 and updated information, and the information is serial number 1, and this is the registration number, and this registration number we are getting from the JavaScript function. For all these three students, student 1, 2, 3, we are getting all these three unique registration number. ALS gives over the first name, second name, that we given third you student name as Max. So you can say this is MA for first two character, and BCA for DC is the first two character of class that's added here. So that's the logic we added in the JavaScript functions, right? So let's go to the integrations. Just I will give you brief on integrations here. So this is the integration I created. I will open this integration in view mode. So just click here. This is the endpoint, trigger endpoint, where we added the request and the response payload. So if you will go to the next here, you can see the configure a request payload is enabled, and configure the endpoint to receive a response payload is also enabled here. Go to next, you will be able to see the request payload here, and once you will click on inline, you will be able to see the same request payload we added, right? This is the request payload, and go to next to see that the response payload here. If you will click here in the response payload, you will be able to see the response that is updated info, serial number, registration number, serial number, registration number. These two are the endpoint we added here. Now let me close. And after that, whatever value we are receiving, we are going to iterate over this element. And this is the for each loop we added. If you will open this for each loop, you will be able to see the student info as a repeating element. So if you will click here, you can see the source coming from execute this the request wrapper, and request wrapper having the node at student info. This student info is the repeated element our node we provided, right? The student info. So loop will iterate over there, and this is the loop variable, loop where student info. This loop variable will store the each and every element one by one. For we have three records, so this loop variable, this loop will iterate three times, and each and every time this variable will store this value. First time it will store this value, second time this will store this value, third time this will store this value. So that kind of things are there, right? Now here you can see inside this for each loop we added one assign. This assign is going to in assign we created one variable. If you will see, it's this instance is creating problem. So let me open this one. Here inside this assign we created one variable name as var code, and in the variable you can see we invoke our function, the JavaScript function we created, FOS underscore generate code, and then function having two parameters. These two parameters we are providing here. You can see these two parameters. This is the first parameter. Here you can see this is the selected one is the first parameter, and from where this parameter is coming you can see loop var underscore student info. This is the loop variable we created, and inside that we have a student info, and then we have name. You can see in the left hand side this is our loop variable we created, that loop var underscore student info. Once you will expand, you will be able to see that the student info node, that's the array node, right? This is our array node, and inside the node you will be able to see the single value for these two, right? That's serial number and name. Loop variable. So these two columns we are able to see only because we open this integration in view mode, and view mode will display only value which we are going to use here, right? So class and name is displaying here. So here you can see, right? So this student info having all the columns display here, serial number, name, class, date, and fee. All this column we added here, right? This is the request payload for this integration. So now all this value we assign here. Out of all this value we used name and class only. From this one we are passing this one. This function will return the return the generated code, and that code having that assigned to that variable, this var code, and this variable we are using in the stitch. So here you can see we added one stitch, the data stitch. That data stitch is going to work with the global variable, and where we created the global variables. So if you will see this x, right? So here we have created two global variables. The gvar is the array, and gvar response is that the node of that array, that student info node we created, right? So this global variable here we are updating the variable here. In the variable you can see the first we are updating the serial number to that global variable, and this serial number you can see once I will open in edit mode, you can see this serial number is coming from the gvar response object. So this is the global variable node serial number, and we are updating this global variable with which value? The value, the serial number. This serial number is coming from this loop variable, this loop variable. So I will expand here. You will be able to see the loop variable. and blue variable having the serial number. Now the global variable serial number updated. Now we have to update the registration number of the global variable. So once you will open here, this registration number column of the global variable is updated by the variable we created, that the var code. So this is the variable here we created, and this var code having the code coming from the JavaScript function, and that value we are mapping in the registration number, and the same we are receiving in the response to the registration number here. So once we done with this two column, now we are appending this two column in the array variable created using global variable. So we created one global variable name as array. You can see the gvar response array. This is our array global variable, and in the variable we are using append operations. If you will see, for the above two we are using assign operation, but for this array one we are using append operation. So that here we created this variable. This variable, each and every time it will come to the student update info node, and it will append this new value to the same variable. That's why here we use append operation. Right, so this is the global variable done. Once the loop will be completed, it will iterate 3 times, as in request payload we pass three values, and each and every time it will update or append the value to the global variable. And now in the last we are mapping global variable to response, so that response can have the updated value which we assign to the global variable. So you can see in the response wrapper, if I will open here, you can see this student updated info is the repeated element, and we map the value from the global variable. You can see here g1 global variable. So this is the integrations which created. So let's move to that integration only, and we will create the same integration from scratch, so that we will understand each and every point. So first we have to create the JavaScript function, so that the JavaScript function we can use in OIC. So now this time what I am going to do, I'm just going to change the JavaScript function name, so that this we can just differentiate between these two different functions. So now this time I'm going to give name as FOAS generate student code. So this is the function name I given, that FOS underscore generate student code, and same I will use the same file. So this is the file name I given, that FOS generate code. So let me change the file name to, so here I'm going to give that FOS generate student code.js, that the JavaScript function. So now you can see this is our JavaScript functions file we created, where we have one functions that generate student code. These functions we are going to import in OIC. So how we can import or create JavaScript functions? Go to that OIC, move to the library, and in the library we just have to click on this import. So once you will click on import, it will ask you to upload the file. So just you have to click here, so that we can upload the file. So I created one function name as FOAS. You can see that FOS generate student info. I will click here and I will open. So that file, it will load the file here. You can see, and that we have to provide the name, the library name. So this two library name already created. So I will give the library name as FOAS underscore Java script lib1. So I'm going to give the library name as FOS JavaScript library1. Just click on import. So once you will click on import, the file be loaded. That file will automatically come here. You can see FOS underscore generate student code. This is the full name here, code.js. You can see, and here this is the function inside this code. So the function name is FOS underscore generate student code, right? So once you will click here, if your code is perfect, right? If you don't have any error in your code, so you just have to click on tick, and you will be able to see the option to provide or select the parameters data type, right? If you will have any error in your code, it will not allow you to make a tick here or select here, right? It will be inactive status. So now everything is fine. You can see the name and class name both are a string in our functions. So here I will select that as a string value name, and the class name is also already selected a string. And what value it's going to return? It's going to return as a code. This is the variable name code. You can see return code, and the data type of this will be a string only. So I don't want to do any changes here. The status of this JavaScript library is draft. So I will click on save. If there will not be any error, it will be saved and status will be changed to configure. Now, if our the library status is in configure, then it means that we can use this library or JavaScript function in our integration. So right now, this is the library we created, and this library doesn't have any integration assigned. That's why you can see integration count is 0, right? And but here you can see in this another library, the library integration count is 3. As this library we used in 3 different integration. These 2 are inactive, and this is one the inactive. This is the function, the integration which we explained earlier, right? So now we have to use this JavaScript function in our integration. So let's move to that integration. So for creating the integration, we just have to click on this create. As we have to pass request payload to the integration, I will select integration type as application. I will give the names. I will give the name FOAS underscore int001 underscore AP underscore. This is going to use for libraries. So I will use lib underscore js for JavaScript underscore gv for global variable underscore for fl for each loop underscore 01. So this is the integration name I given. You can give any of the name whatever you want. I don't want to provide any packages name or anything. Let it be the same. Just click on create. So once you will click on create, integration will be created. And in the canvas page, we have to add the we have to load the integration. Let me refresh the page or open this integration again. Once I will click like open this one. So right now, if you will see earlier, we already created integration, but we didn't save or we didn't do any changes. And we just have to reload pages and all. So that's why integration status is in lock. So we have to unlock the integration. So just click on unlock. So once you will unlock, it will ask you to unlock that integration. So once you will unlock, it will be displayed in the draft as we don't have any endpoint added. So just edit the integration. And now here you have to see, we have to add the trigger endpoint. So I will add REST trigger endpoint to the integration. So I will use created into trigger connection we already created, that FOAS underscore this one REST tree connection, right? So I will use this one. Here we have to give the name. So I will use the name start REST. Next. And here we have to provide the endpoint name. So I will give the endpoint name as I will use something like AP lib underscore js underscore gv for global variable, js for JavaScript, lib for library, and I will use fl for each loop. So this is the endpoint name I just want to give. And now here we have to select the method. So method I will select as post. So why we are selecting post? Because we have to select the request and the response payload both. So I selected the method as post. Here we have to click on this tick, these two, so that this one will allow us to configure the request payload. This will allow us to configure the response payload. After that, I don't want to do any changes here. Just click on continue. And now you can see configure request configuration page open. Here we have to provide the request payload. So click on inline. We already have the request payload, sample request payload. You can see. So this is the request payload, same I can use. So I will just copy this request payload and I will paste it here. Everything is fine. Just click on continue. So if your JSON code will be correct, so it will load and just go next. And this is response configuration page where we have to provide the response. What kind of response you want to add? So we want to add response here, this kind of response. But in the response, let's add the student name too. So let me add one more column here, name, right? This name I will copy. So that in response we will get name 2. So I will provide the mapping of name 2. So this is our response payload. I will copy this response payload and I will click on inline, provide the payload here, continue. Everything is fine. We'll go continue. It will show the summary page and we have to click on finish to finalize the endpoint. So now our integration is ready. We added the endpoints. Let me save first so that it will not remove. Now in the integrations, we have to add the loop. so that loop can be iterated over the repeated element which we will pass as a request payload from here, right, from this while running the integration. So this is the endpoint where we have the repeated element. So I will add the for each loop. So whatever operations or object we have to add between this endpoint and the mapper only, right? So I will use it for each loop. You can see here inside that, once you will click on and action inside the logic, you will get one action. The name is for each. So just you have to drag this action here. Once you will drag, it will ask you to provide the name to the endpoint. So you can see for each one, instead of for each one, I will give the student for each. This is the name I given. And here you can see repeated element. We have to provide the repeated element. So where you will get the repeated elements? You will get the repeated element in request wrapper. So expand this request wrapper. You will be able to see the repeated element node, that is student info. This is the same student info here, which we configure as a simple request payload, right? So this is a student array element. Once you will expand, you can see we have all the columns which we are going to pass. This box, multiple box, is the icon which is going to identify the array element. So this is our array element. We are going to map this array element here to the repeating element tab. So now this array element mapped here, so whatever number of record will be there, that loop will iterate that number of times. Now this is the variable, right? The loop variable. So by default it will come, but I don't want to provide this value. So I will create another, will give the name. So I will give the name as loop var. So whenever I'm creating any loop variable, I'm giving the name as var. Whenever I'm creating any local variable using assign, I'm giving the name as var underscore. And whenever I'm creating any variable, global variable, I'm giving the name as gvar. So I will show you that too. So this is loop var underscore. What is the purpose of this loop var? So the purpose of this loop var for student for each. So I will give the name here loop var student for each, right? So that it will be easy to identify or understand. So just click outside so that for each loop will be configured, and you can see the for each loop configured here, and this is the scope of for each loop. So whatever object or whatever operation we will do here, it will not be accessible outside. So that's the things of that, the scope. So now this loop is ready. Now inside the loop we have to perform operations. So what operations we have to perform inside the loop? First we have to call the JavaScript. To call the JavaScript, we have two options. One, an easy option is just we can use that JavaScript endpoint to call the functions, and in the endpoint response we will get the value. Or another way, we can create one variable, and in that variable we will assign that function mapping. So in example, I show you the variable one. This time I will go for, let's go for the action JavaScript. So I will drag JavaScript here. It did that. Let me add again. So it's adding the configuration phase of JavaScript. So here you can see once we added, this asking for the JavaScript endpoint name. So I will give the name as get student code underscore JS. JS is like JavaScript, right? So take here. Now here we have to select the functions. So just click on function. It will list you all the functions created in your instance, right? So what is our function name? If you will see, our function name was this one, right? So if you will search this function with this name, you will be able to see the function here. You can see FOS generate student code function, and these functions come under library, that is FOS Java underscore script underscore library one, LIB1. This is the library we created, right? If you will try to find the previous one which we created, so previous function I created was, it's showing error because we have not configured well. So just click on function. Here you can see the previous we created FOS. Here you can see the old functions which we created earlier, that FOS generate code. So instead of that, we have to use generate student code, right, from this library. So I will select this one. Once you will select, here you can see it's asking the value. It's asking the name parameters and the class name parameters. These two parameters are coming from here only, name parameter, class name parameter. So just click here and Just click here, we have to provide the name value. So for this name, from where we will get this name? So we will get the name from this loop variable. This is the loop, right? So if we have 4 record, this loop will iterate 4 times, and all the times it will pick variable values, array values, and it will store in the loop variable. So here you can see we have the loop variable we created, loop var underscore student for each. This is the loop variable we created. So expand the loop variable. Here you can see the name. So I will map this name here, and here class name. So I will click on this class name so that it will open the expression. Again, I will expand the loop variable, and here you can see this is the class I map. And one thing, if you will see, the loop variable will hold all the element which we have in the repeated element. So the repeated element we have in the request wrapper, if you will open the request wrapper, you can see this student info is the repeated element here, array element. And but the student info inside the loop variable is simple node, right? We don't have array because the array is here in the request payload, and we added the loop over there, so that the loop variable will store each and every record for that array, right? You can see the same number of column available in the loop variable. Okay. Right, so now our function call is done. I will just click outside to configure. Now here you can see we added endpoint to call the JavaScript function. In the response of this endpoint, we will get the value. What value we will get? In the response of this endpoint, we will get the endpoint name as code. This code is our response from this endpoint. And what is the name of this endpoint? The name of this endpoint is get student code underscore JS. So this value we have to map in the response, right? So here, this is the response, right? So for this response, first we have to create one variable. That variable can store these 3 values. First, we have to create one simple variable. That simple variable can store these 3 values, just like that. Here, let me copy this one. First, we have to create one variable, right? And that variable can store these 3 values. So we know that the variable we are going to create using assign, that can store only one value. But where we have 3 variable, right? 3 column or 3 attribute, that assign variable cannot store this 3 endpoint, 3 column. And that's why it's complex type variable, right? So for achieving this one, we have to create global variable, so that in the global variable, we will provide this endpoint, so that that global variable can be created using that endpoint only. So for creating the global variable, here you just have to click on this X icon. Let me save the integration first. So I will click on this X here, and here you can see once you will click here, it will ask you to create global variables. Just click on this one, it will give you the name. So just here we have to provide the name to the global variable. So I will give the name as gvar underscore a student object. So this is the object which will store these 3 columns. So where we have to provide the mapping. So this is the variable name as gvar student object, and here we have to select the type. So this is a string, boolean, date time, object, and all. So we just have to select the object, so that this can store multiple columns. So from where it will get the data type. So here you can see this is the structure which we want to achieve, and this we configure in the response payload. So we will go to the response payload. You can see this start rest execute. Inside that we have request payload, but we have to get the sample from response payload. So response payload, you can see start rest having this response payload. So once you will click here, in the execute response, we have the response payload. You can see the response wrapper. Inside the response wrapper, we have the node that is student updated. You can see this is the student updated node, and inside the student updated node, you can see we have all this column. So we want to create one variable which can contain all these 3 columns, right? So I will just drag the type here, so that our gvar underscore student object variable will be created, and this variable will store all these node. This student as a node, student updated info as a node, and this node having these 3 values. So now our one variable is created. That variable will store this 3 info. And now we have to create array variable. That array variable will store repeated element of this node, right? This node. So again, I will click on this plus icon to create one global variable. So I will give the name as gvar underscore. This time it will be student object array. array, right? So I given the name as array. To select the variable, again we will select the data type object, but this time, if you remember, last time we selected the node here, right? Last time we selected this node, and this node having these three columns, but this time we want to create array variable, and which node having array element? This response wrapper node having array element, right? So this time I will drag this response wrapper. And you can see in the first time we selected that student updated info, this node as a global variable, so that it can store these three column at single time. And now this time when we created array variable, given the just name as array, this is the name, right? Try to understand, this is just for name array I given, so that the value, this variable will hold the array element. To just identify, we instead of using this endpoint, we use this the parent, which is response wrapper, and we know that this response wrapper having the node that is array node. So that's why when this variable will be created, this variable will be created as a response node, as a array of this endpoint. So now our global variable is created. You just have to click outside to submit the global variable. So global variable we created, that global variable will be accessible everywhere, anywhere in this integration canvas. Even it will be accessible in the global fault also. In our upcoming sessions, we will see the global fault too. Now here we created global variable. Now first we have to update the global variable value. So for example, here we created two variable, right? One variable we created this one, right? And another variable we created array of this one, right? We created array of this endpoint. We created array of this point, but in a starting, this variable will hold the null value. The array variable will hold the null value here, right? And this variable will also store the null value here in the first iteration or the first time when it will execute. Now here first, this is the student object variable. These two global variable we created, right? Here you can see these two global variable we created. Let me check the name. So this is the name of first gvar student object. So let me give the name as gvar object, and this is the second variable we given the name as gvar underscore student object array, right? These two variable we created. Now first we have to update the global object variable with this three value. Then we will map this value, this value to this global variable, to this array variable, right? So let me move to the integration here. For assigning the value to the global variable, we require data stitch. So you can see here we have another action, that is data stitch. So we just have to drag this data stitch here. So once you will drag this data stitch, it will ask you the variable name, which variable you want to update. So first we want to update this variable, that is the G variable student object. And for this variable, we want to update the value of SL, NO, name and registration number. So first we will select the variables. Just click here. Our variable name is gvar student object. Expand this one. Expand this one. And for this, we want to update the serial number. So I will direct the serial number and I will select the operation and assign, as we just want to store the value. So for which value we want to store? This is our array element. And for this, if loop will iterate first time, it will store this value in the loop variable. And this variable having serial number having this value as 1. So the 1 will be stored in this serial number. So from where we will get 1? We will get 1 from the loop variable. So let's move to the loop variable. This is the loop variable, loop var student for each. So expand this loop var, expand this one, and here you can see we have the student NO. So I will map this student NO here. So now you can see the loop variable object, right? Loop object, sorry, global object variable having of a serial number will be assigned to the value from the loop variable. So now the serial number is done. Now next we have to update the name of the student. So I will again, this is the global variable name. I will drag the name here. If you will click here, you will be able to see the complete path for this name. And this name I want to store value from the global variable. So value from the loop variable. This is the loop variable, right? So I will drag this name here, assign. Now these two value will be updated from loop variable, and this registration number we will get from the JavaScript endpoint response, right? From JavaScript. So here you can see this is our JavaScript endpoint. In the response of this endpoint, we will get the value. But here you can see by mistake when we added the endpoint, that endpoint got by that endpoint, the stitch endpoint get added before this JavaScript. That's why if you will see here, this JavaScript endpoint you will not be able to find in your integration. So if you will click here, you can see what is the name of the endpoint, get student code underscore JS. Here you can see you will not be able to find this end node. Get no, it's not there, right? Why? Because we are here, our control is here, and before that it's not there, right? So we will move this one, cut, and we will paste after this endpoint. So now our data stitch is after JS, the JavaScript call, and now we will be able to find here. So just click this one, and once we will expand, you can see the get student code, you will be able to find here, get student code JS. Now we have to update the variable, the registration number. So I will select the registration number of the global variable, the registration number, and the registration number we want to update by getting from the get student response, right? Get student JS call. So this is the output get student JS call. I will just open here. So now you can see our global variable, we use data stitch to update this three column of the global variable. This three column of the global variable is updated. Now in next step, we will use another stitch. In the stitch, we will update this array. We will append this array by this value. So this value we already got, and we will use this value to append in the array object, right? So for that, even you can use this one here only, or if you don't want to use, you can use another stitch. So I will use here only. So just click on plus. Now here we have to select the global variable array. So this is our array value. You can see this is our array, and just I will drag this array here. So this array, instead of assign, I want to add append, so that each and every time if our loop will iterate 4 times, this 4 times value will be appended here one by one, like that, right? So that's we are going to do. So this is our first value. When loop will iterate first time, this node will be added here. When loop will iterate second time, as we are using append, so it will iterate like that, right? That's why our response will be ready. So now here, from where we have to append, we have to append from the global variable we created above, right? We used above. So where is our global variable object? So this is our global variable object. So I will drag this here. You can see the student info. Instead of the wrapper, we have to select the student info only, right? This student info. Now array global variable student update info array element will be appended with the value coming from the global variable as an object we created, right? So now our data stitch is ready. Just click outside. If you will not have any error in the data stitch, you will be able to see here successfully. Now once loop will iterate 4 times, for example, 4 times this process will be called. So 4 times the JavaScript will be called. 4 times it will pass the value, it will return the value, and that return value we will map to the global variable, and all this value we will map append into the global array variable, right? So now our this process is completed. After that, in the integration, this is the response of integration. In the response, we want to map the global variable value. So just double click here. And here once you will expand, here you can see this is the array element, and in the array element we have to map this array element with the global variable element. This is our global variable array element which we appended. This expand, here you can see the array element. So this array and this array will be automatically mapped. So here once we will map, automatically it will iterate the loop here, so that whatever repeated element is there, that will be mapped to the response. We will explain this, I will explain this array node part later in our upcoming session. So I will map all this column here, the source column. Just click on validate, go back, save, and here our integration is ready. Just let me add one logger here so that we can display the global variable message. So let me add the logger here so that in the activity stream I will show you the message. So this is the logger here. So I will give the name as and I want to print the message, print the variable value of the global variable, right? So this is the global variable. Let's map here. Let's see if we are not getting any error. Save, go back. So here we have one error. So we know that we have to assign the business identifier. Just click here, assign the business identifier. So let's example, I will take the student name only. Anything, student serial number, name. Let me provide here two variable. Let's go here. So here we have just have to save. So our integration is ready to activate. It's in configure status. Go back and we have to activate this integration. Now we have to run this integration. So let's go back and click on run. So while running the integration, we have to provide the value as a request payload, right? So what I will do, I will remove these values, the sample. So value, whatever we are getting here, that's the sample value which we provided in the endpoint, right? While configuration. So I will delete this one. So this is the value we already created. So let me add few more value here. Let me add one more value here. So now let me save. So this value just going to provide to the integration. So we given the request payload here. Now we just have to click on run. So once we will click on run, this value will be passed to integration. Integration will process this value, and based on the logic we added, it will return the response. And the response you can see we got the same. So let me copy this one. And if I will provide the response here you can see what we receive. We receive a student updated info. This is the student serial number 1, name as Alex, and this is the registration number we receive from the JavaScript. So how we receive this one from JavaScript? If you will see, this is our integration log. Let me expand this one. So here you can see, right? Once integration got executed, we pass the value as a request payload. So you can see this is the trigger. If you will click here, whatever value we passed, you will be able to see the value here, right? This is the value which we send to the integration while executing, right, as a request payload. So now after that, based on that value, that loop will iterate. You can see we added the loop. You can see for each loop, and name of the loop endpoint was student underscore for each. You can see total number of iteration, the 5 iteration. Why we have 5 iteration? Because we pass the 5 record. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We pass the 5 record. And once you will expand here, all the 5 iteration you will be able to see. So if you will append first iteration, this is the value passed to the variable, that loop variable we created for each and every iteration. So if you will expand here, you will be able to see the first value. This is the value which will be assigned to the loop variable we given the name, right? the first value. If you will go to the second iterations, let me explain this one. If you will go to the second iteration, if you will click here, message received by ForEach, you will be able to see the second value, that is you can see serial number 2. If you will go to the third iteration, you will see serial number 3. So each and every iteration having single record, and for that record we have done the process. So what process we have done, you can see. First we added the JavaScript call. So you can see invoke JavaScript function. This is the JavaScript function endpoint name we given, and this is the value we passed. So while invoking, what value we passed? We passed the value, and somewhere we will be able to see. Here you can see we passed the value. Not able to see here because we passed the value in the endpoint only. That's why we don't have here. But here you can see in the response from this get student.js, we have the code. You can see that AL926BT. Same response we got, AL962BT, right? BT for BTech, AL for LX. This is the name, right? We got this value from the JavaScript call, and after that we added the stitch, right? And all these are coming from stitch because for each and every one we added 3-4 variables. For this stitch we are not able to see because stitch message is not showing in the log. And this stitch is responsible for doing the value addition, right? Merging the value and all. And after that we added the logger, given the name as print global variable logger. In the logger we appended the value. So if you will click here, you can see the logger having the value as serial number, name, registration number. This is the endpoint we have displayed in the logger, right? And this logger this value we map in the array element. That's why when all the endpoints, all this one are completed, you can see this value, right? The logger value, this value appended all the 5 times to the array variable, serial number, name, and the registration number. This is this value variable we created, the global variable as object, and this we merge to the, we use append operation of global data stitch to merge to the global variable array we created. And in that same we mapped in the response. So if you will see message sent to reply, you can see this is the value displaying here. In OIC, whatever operations you are going to perform, whatever value you are transforming one endpoint to endpoint, internally it's going to convert it into XML only. So that's why here you can see this is XML, but in integration response we are getting JSON. Why? Because we configured the type as JSON. So that is all about the today's sessions which we learn. We learn about JavaScript call, we learn about libraries, we learn about that for each variable, for each loop, we learn about the global variable and data stage. I hope you understand. Obvious, if you have any queries and all, you can come to us and you can ask your queries. Thank you so much for joining today's session.